Well, hello there once again, everyone. Today, we are going to be looking at the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, continuing a look at the progressive era. We've discussed how there are really three presidents that we consider the progressive presidents, of course, Teddy Roosevelt being the first of them, and his successor, Taft, being the second. And today we will look at what's considered the third and the final of the progressive presidents, and that is President Woodrow Wilson, who is probably, I think it's safe to say, probably better known as the World War I president. Those are some of the things that he probably gets the most attention for, and probably that his legacy is probably more closer tied with. However, there are some significant progressive reforms, some really significant, and some of the permanent ones that come out of the Wilson administration. And Wilson is also an interesting president. Kind of complicated, whose legacy has become more complicated, particularly in the past handful of years. And we'll look at some of that as we move along as well. So, first of all, let's just sort of talk or remind ourselves of sort of where we are as far as presidential politics and the progressive movement. You may recall that Roosevelt initiated multiple progressive reforms, including advocating for consumer protection, for conservation, was the first to mediate a labor dispute and not immediately side with the employers, and to demand that a settlement be reached, or to use force, to keep a mine working in the case of the anthracite coal strike and all of that. We saw his trust busting, and then we saw him step down and Taft become president, sort of with Roosevelt's blessing, with the expectation that he would continue Roosevelt's reforms, do what Roosevelt was doing. And then that rift, of course, appears between them, as Roosevelt thought Taft was not progressive enough, and also going after things, particularly going after some of the trusts that Roosevelt believed were the good trusts, some of the ones that Roosevelt actually had some financial ties to. So he was not very happy with Taft about that. So there's this split growing. That's where we left off, this split growing in the Republican Party from those that are more conservative, that align themselves with Taft, and the far more progressive wing of the Republican Party that start to refer to themselves as the progressives and defining themselves politically that way, that are rallying behind Roosevelt. So after Taft's term, Roosevelt, as we mentioned, is not too happy about him, and that has led to that split in the Republican Party, which sets the stage for the election of 1912, in which we're going to see a phenomenon happen that we've seen happen a couple of times, for in different times for different reasons, but it always ends up with a similar result, and that is the split of a political party. What's going to happen here? So we'll look at the Republicans in just a second. We already know that there's a rift growing there between Taft, who's seeking re-election, and Roosevelt, who's trying to stage a comeback, after feeling that Taft has betrayed what Roosevelt intended for him to do. So the Democrats are going to nominate Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson is a different kind of presidential candidate, and will of course become president, that we had not seen before, and that Wilson was not a career politician. He only had relatively recently got into politics. He's the governor of New Jersey at the time. But Wilson's career was actually as an academic, as an intellectual. He was a college professor and had become the president of Princeton University. And so this was one of the first times you saw a high-minded academic, and intellectual, very intellectual person. Not to say there weren't intellectual presidents, but people that had made that their career, that was their life's work, not so much politics and elected offices and things like that. So very much a different kind of a presidential candidate, but a very, like I said, intelligent, intellectual, well-spoken, very religious. He was brought up in a religious family. I'm wanting to say his father was a Presbyterian minister, or maybe even Woodrow Wilson might have even had some ministerial background. I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but anyway, and that serves him in both positive ways, and it can also make him rather inflexible and rather stubborn. But it very much influences his sense of morality, his sense of right and wrong. And Wilson, and we'll see this especially when it comes to, or I think it shows up especially in regard to his foreign policy, his strong sense of morality, a strong moral center, and a strong commitment to do what was right. We'll see that a lot, although there are, some interesting layers to that. But anyway, Wilson runs as the Democrat, and Wilson is a progressive, but he's a little different than Roosevelt. His campaign is going to contrast to what Roosevelt is trying to say. Wilson's campaign is what he calls, or his sort of slogan, his platform, the whole message that he ties into his campaign as far as what he wants to do is what's called New Freedom. And the New Freedom platform, his proposals, what he's running on, is stronger antitrust laws, lower tariffs, and banking reform. Those are the three big things. And we're going to see that all happen again in just a moment. When he does become president, he will act on all of those things. But this is different from what Roosevelt wants to do, because a lot of it's not about Wilson's not so much promising or talking about lots and lots of new big sweeping laws and new big programs and new big commissions and all these sorts of things. Wilson is wanting a more just enforcing what we have, use what we have better, that we don't need more laws, we don't need more commissions, we don't need more government intervention. Well, we do need more government intervention, but we don't need to create new things in order to do that. We need to just better enforce what we have. The groundwork is there. We need to give it more teeth, and we need to give it more attention and allow those things to work better for us. But the answer is to just better enforce what we've got, and not just pile on more and more and more government involvement in the economy. Recognizing that, yes, in this day and age, there's got to be some more government involvement and government oversight, that's just the reality of the time. But that we don't need to maybe do it quite as much as what Roosevelt is thinking, which is, we'll get to him in just a second. So then, to make things particularly interesting, in 1912, we have a split in the Republican Party, which we have already pretty much established that that's going to happen. So that rift had been growing for a while. And in the election of 1912, the Republicans do officially split, and they run two different candidates, or rather a significant portion of the Republican Party breaks off and won't support Taft. So Taft runs as the official Republican candidate, but then we have the progressive wing of the Republican Party that nominates Teddy Roosevelt. And they are the progressives, a progressive wing of the Republican Party, but has become so pronounced by this point that they're actually calling themselves a progressive party, but actually also go by the name the Bull Moose Party. That came from Teddy Roosevelt, who said their party was as strong as a bull moose, which, again, we've talked before about how Roosevelt is very much the outdoorsy, the huntsman, the big macho man kind of guy, likes his, to wear his masculinity on his sleeve as much as he can. So he uses that phrase that they were as strong as a bull moose. And so the Progressive Party in 1912, also known as the Bull Moose Party, and runs Teddy Roosevelt as their candidate. Roosevelt, by this point, is advocating pretty, maybe extreme is too strong of a word, but pretty significant progressive reforms that he is wanting to go after. And he calls this new nationalism. And we know that the word nationalism implies strong national government. That implies, it means strong national power, big government involvement. And obviously, by this point, Roosevelt is definitely much more of a nationalist, wanting bold federal action, more involvement to consolidate the trust, to go after more trust, big government actions here. He's supporting women's suffrage. He is supporting more social welfare programs, whether that is more assistance for the poor, more, better housing, better regulations in the cities, all those sorts of things. So he is talking about, because Roosevelt truly believes, as a lot of progressives did, and this has always been something that progressives believed. It's the thing that unites the progressives, is that the government had to act here, that it wasn't enough to just have societies and charities and churches and, individual people trying to fix these problems, that it took national power, that it took the government's power in order to do those things, that the government had to act. And so Roosevelt is, a voice of that whole idea that the government must be an instrument of social justice. And that's what new nationalism is partly all about. Going back to Wilson for a second, Wilson is saying all those goals are the same things that he wants, cleaning things up and, going after the big trusts and fixing things is his goal, but to do it with a more free market approach, with less government intervention, less government involvement, less big government, and to do this in a way that requires, a little bit more of a hands-off approach, not laissez-faire. Obviously, he would say that we're past that, but not near as much as what Roosevelt wants. Well, in the election, as you can probably guess, Wilson wins, as we tend to see in instances when a political party splits like that. We saw that in 1860, and you see it a few other times. It splits the vote. It splits both the popular and then therefore the electoral vote, and so they really kind of shoot themselves in the foot and not able to get a majority. So Wilson is going to win the election. He only gets 41% of the popular vote. That is another thing that is typical of elections like that, is that the winner, doesn't get a majority of the popular vote, but they get the electoral vote, and that's how he wins the White House. So Wilson wins in 1912, and now we're going to look at his progressive reforms that he is going to help enact, or rather that he's going to propose and support, and see what happens there. So Wilson's New Freedom in action. Wilson's New Freedom proposal, what he was going after, and his agenda was going after what he called the triple wall of privilege, meaning sort of the three areas. And then we kind of already said these when we talked about his New Freedom platform, but the three areas, the three institutions, the three parts of the economy or what have you, that needed to be tackled, that needed to be reformed and needed to be dealt with to make the system work better for everyone. And that triple wall of privilege was the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. Okay, so the banks, the tariffs, and the trusts, in whatever order you want to consider that in. That those were kind of the three areas that were putting, sort of other people, some people obviously were benefiting from it, but only a small number of people were benefiting from the way those things worked. And to make it work better for everyone, and therefore improve society, improve the economy for everyone, those things needed to be dealt with. So let's see how he goes after those three things. First, with the tariffs. We know that tariffs have been a big, big issue for a long, 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 long time. This is not new. The tariff reform, that the main thing that happens under Wilson is we see the passage of what's called the Underwood Tariff, which lowered the tariff significantly. As far as the percentage and all of that, you don't necessarily need to know, but it lowered it more significantly. It was probably the biggest or the largest decrease in the tariff that there had been in decades. And tariffs continue, with a couple of exceptions here or there, particularly in the World War I years and the years afterwards. We continue to see tariffs lowered and lowered and lowered. Part of the reason for that is because of the 16th Amendment. That's one of the reasons why that is able to happen. If you may recall, we talked about that actually in a previous section, that 16th Amendment was passed under Taft. It doesn't go into effect until under Wilson. So that's why we see the ability to lower tariffs. Remember that the 16th Amendment, that is one of the progressive era amendments. That is the one that allows the collection of income taxes. So tax on your income. And with that 16th Amendment in place, that replaces tariff revenue. That's one of the reasons why they can start lowering tariffs significantly, is because the income tax becomes the number one way that the government gets its revenue rather than from tariffs. So it means that tariffs could be lowered. This is why groups like farmers and progressives supported an income tax. One, because it's a graduated income tax, meaning the more you make, the more you pay. But it also means that tariffs could be significantly lowered, if not all but gotten rid of. And tariffs, as we've talked about many, many times, tend to affect lower classes harder. They tend to be less beneficial to lower class Americans rather than higher class or higher socioeconomic status Americans. So tariffs are significantly lowered. And Congress also begins collecting the income tax, which means that it all kind of comes out in the wash, and so there's not a huge loss in revenue. Now, when it comes to banking, let's kind of remind ourselves what's going on with the banking system, and how Wilson. This is probably, and this is just me saying this, but as far as progressive reforms go, this may be the thing that Wilson does that may be the most significant. It is certainly the most lasting of the probably the biggest change that actually becomes a permanent one, and that has to do with the banking system. Now, if you'll think way back, the very first time we ever talked about a national bank was back in the 1790s. If you remember Hamilton's first proposal for the first national bank, which was chartered in the 1790s, it then expired, and then you saw it rechartered as part of the American system under Henry Clay. And then you may recall that whole bank war business with Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, who didn't like the bank, said that it was, a undemocratic institution, that it was benefiting the wealthy and hurt the poor. And there was that whole bank war business with Jackson first vetoing the bank bill and then withdrawing the government's money and killing the bank. Well, ever since then, there has been no national bank. There was no national banking system ever since Jackson destroyed it back in the 1830s, so for quite some time. And Wilson believes, as a lot of progressives believed, that that was a bad thing, that particularly with the United States having grown significantly, the United States goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean by this point, with the United States having the massive amount of industry that it does, that whole not having some kind of a national banking system was just not effective. And the banking system, there needed to be one, essentially. But Wilson worried that, and a lot of this banking is complicated, so I'm trying to explain it without going into too much detail about banking itself, because it's a hard concept and you don't necessarily need to know all of that. But that this one, it meant the banking system was just, currency and the value of currency and paper money and all that stuff was just way too volatile, and it was there needed to be some kind of regulation. If you remember, we've talked about banking in the past, and one of the big arguments in favor of a national bank, and always had been, was the bank was a good stabilizer of things, that a national bank would kind of cushion the ups and downs of the economy. The economy goes up and it comes down. That's just the natural ebb and flow of things. But having a centralized banking system is like a regulator of that keeps those highs from being too high and those lows from being too lows, that controls the amount of money that's out in circulation, that can withdraw it if there's too much, can put more out there if there's not enough, some way to make that more flexible and to be more responsive to the needs of the economy. And there hadn't been a national bank to do that up until this point. So with the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, that's going to change. What this does is it creates the Federal Reserve, which you may have heard of, or may have heard it called by its nickname, the Fed. It is sometimes just called the Fed, but that stands for the Federal Reserve Board, which governs the Federal Reserve System. Oftentimes when I teach about the national bank in the 10th grade, people say, do we have a national bank today? The answer is yes, and that is the Federal Reserve. We just don't call it the national bank anymore. It is the Federal Reserve. And this is a national banking system, but it looks a lot different than the national bank that you saw in the 19th century. This is a decentralized banking system. The way the Federal Reserve works, which is, again, without going into too much detail about it because it is kind of complicated, you have 12 banks as 12 main branches of the Federal Reserve, which you see on this map down here. So you can see the closest one to us is in Atlanta. And it is those branches of the Federal Reserve that issue paper money, that do all sorts of things. And all that's not really necessary. But the idea is that instead of having one branch, which was usually in New York, to make those decisions and to send out money and things like that when people needed it, that wasn't really effective with a country the size that it was by this point. So by spreading it out over these 12 different branches, you were decentralizing it so they could respond to particular areas. It just makes it much more flexible and much more responsive and much more reactive. And the Fed, again, that refers to the Federal Reserve Board. That is a board of regulators that are appointed by the president. It's a commission. or it's an agency. They're appointed by the president to monitor the banking system and to monitor all this. They're the ones that like lower and raise the interest rates today. They'll talk about, if you're listening to the news or something, they'll say, oh, the Fed today decided to raise interest rates by 1 point or decided to keep it the same. That's part of their job, is to decide what the interest rates are going to be, which controls the money supply. You'll learn more about that in economics next year. But the idea is this created a more stable banking system to better respond to the financial and economic needs of the United States in a much more industrialized era. And again, I think you could make the case that this is maybe one of the biggest things that Wilson does, because what we're going to find is that a lot of progressive reforms, many of them don't last, is that a lot of them, once we get out of the progressive era, a lot of them get reversed, a lot of them get overturned. It's not certainly not the case for all of them, like, for example, the amendments, but the banking changes are another one that remains, and that is something that is still hugely important today. The Federal Reserve is quite a powerful institution. That we depend on greatly for monetary and fiscal, or mainly for what we call monetary policy in the United States. The next big thing that Wilson goes after is the trusts, and there's kind of two big ways that he does that. Again, Wilson didn't believe that it was necessary to pass a whole lot of new laws, but to better enforce the existing ones. Yet we do see some new things happening. One is the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. This is also known as the FTC. The Federal Trade Commission is a regulatory commission, obviously, that is charged with looking into business practices. So it is their job to investigate business practices and to deal with, prosecute even anything that's going on that is illegal. So it is providing more teeth, more enforcement power for some of those existing regulations. So it is the FTC that will look into if there are accusations of something underhanded going on, and the FTC could have the authority to bring charges or to, enforce other regulations on businesses. So it's just a way for the government to enforce a lot of things that perhaps before they may not have had the ability to do. Like, there may have been laws in the books to say certain things were illegal, but if you don't have a way to stop it, what are you going to do? So the FTC does some of that. Another thing, let me go back. That I would add to that is the Clayton Antitrust Act. Okay, the Clayton Antitrust Act. The Clayton Antitrust Act, you may remember we had the Sherman Antitrust Act a while back, but the problem with the Sherman Antitrust Act was that it wasn't being enforced. And when it was being enforced, it was being enforced oftentimes against kind of the wrong people. Like, it was being enforced against labor unions. And it was one of the things that kept labor unions from being successful, is that law was being used against them to bust them up. And the Clayton Antitrust Act, as well as strengthening and adding more teeth to the Sherman Antitrust Act, adding more practices, adding more stuff to say it's illegal. But the big thing about the Clayton Antitrust Act is it specifically says that the antitrust laws cannot be used against labor unions. It officially exempts labor unions from those antitrust laws, which was a big win for labor. Other than that, other than these three big things, there are other progressive reforms that Wilson does support, and there are going to be federal laws enacted regarding loans to farmers. We're going to see more infrastructure being built, highways. There's an 8-hour workday that is added, and a ban on child labor. Many of those things actually won't last past the progressive movement, but it is a short-term gain. And then we see some of those things come back up again a little bit later. Again, with Wilson, I think it's safe to say probably the thing that his legacy gets more focused on is World War I, which is part of the reason why some of these progressive reforms kind of hit a brick wall, is because by 1917, the United States is at war. By 1914, Europe's at war, and the United States is watching that and kind of concerned about it. So those things, foreign issues, start to consume a lot of people's minds, which ultimately spells the end for progressivism for a couple of reasons. So that's what we'll be looking at next, is those events happening across the Atlantic and Wilson's response to that, and how he attempts to navigate the United States through its first involvement in a world conflict and its first involvement in a foreign war. So that is what we'll be looking at next time.